Okay, well, this is the second in a series on interviews related to humanitarianism. And I'm pleased to be able to talk today with Wissam al-Saliby. And Wissam is the advocacy officer with the World Evangelical Alliance in Geneva, working with the Human Rights Council. So we're going to talk some today about Wissam, how he got into this work, the type of work that he does, and some examples of it. So I'm really pleased to have Wissam to talk with us today. So Wissam, please go ahead and tell us about yourself and how you got into this work.
Thank you, David, for hosting me and for this conversation. I'm Lebanese, and I've lived almost all my life in Lebanon, where I grew up. And the initial 7 years of my life, I grew up in a civil war context, and after that, in a post-Civil War context, which includes a lot of its own challenges. And as I grew up, I grew up in a, there's something I grew up with that, in retrospect, I think it was beautiful to be at, is the ability to grow up with Muslims, Christians, and then within the Christians, you have Orthodox, Maronite, Catholics, Evangelicals, and then within the Muslim, you have Shia, Sunni, Druze, and other communities. You grew up in school, going to school, you're not aware of that you're in a unique context. But now that after relocating to Geneva, when I got in touch more with the Western world's challenges and what they're facing, you realize how beautiful and formative it is to grow up, despite being a post-Civil War country with its own tensions, still growing up in tremendous religious diversity. And I think this shaped me significantly. And I'm starting off with this point to say that now that I'm in ministry and we're working on human rights advocacy, approaching Islam, approaching our role as a church is very essential for all the advocacy work that we do. To talk more about myself, so I'm currently 35 years old, and as soon as I finished high school, I went into law school. That's a system in Lebanon inspired from the French system, where you just go into law school. And I finished 4 years and did a master's degree focused on human rights law and humanitarian law. I've always wanted to move into human rights work, and that went in parallel with going to church and being a faithful Christian. Parallel meaning they did not really intersect. I did not see initially the intersection between my faith and my walk with the Lord and human rights work. That was because initially the church I used to go to before in the first 10 years of my life did not talk about integral mission and the intersection between our faith and our kingdom work, that I'll be talking about it in a few minutes. So I went to law school, I studied law, I focused on human rights, I work on human rights, I worked on refugee rights, I work on issues related to Palestinian refugees, to armed conflict in the region, before being called to ministry and working in ministry in Lebanon. And when I was doing the job interview to work with the Arab Baptist Theological Seminary, the president told me, "Why do you want to move to the seminary?" And I told him, well, because I've been in human rights, working in human rights, but I feel like there's a disconnect between my work and my faith. And he said, well, if you join us, we will want to send you back to the field to do human rights as a Christian ministry. This is what he said in the job interview. Because of how, in a seminary like that in the Arab world, how the perception of God's kingdom in the Arab world is way broader than, what I grew up to, at least, the narrow church. I moved to ABTS, to the Arab Baptist Theological Seminary. I worked there for almost 5 years before starting my current position in Geneva now, as Advocacy Officer of the World Evangelical Alliance. I guess this is a brief overview of how I got here and how I got to this interview.
Yeah, so it sounds like that diversity that you spoke to is really important, and I'm guessing that it helps you to understand how different groups of people view the world, but also be able to work across boundaries, so to speak, and to be able to work with people from various backgrounds. Would that be fair to say?
Diversity first and foremost shows us the human beings, and it prevents growing up, having this diversity of people in my classroom and befriending people before going to the age where you would start getting stereotypes of the other. It just shows, it helps preempt later on in life when you would start hearing of the hideous other, but then in your head the hideous other actually is a human being with the same motivations as you are, because I have the image from my high school and before high school, age 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So it helps understand better the world, and then of course later on to work in various contexts and to do advocacy and also it helps to be the church in the Arab world. It's strong to be. You cannot be the church in the Arab world having some conceptions that exist in the churches elsewhere in the world of the Muslims and of the other. So, yeah, I don't know if I answer your question directly.
Yeah, well, I think you did, and I think that that's a really important point in terms of knowing different groups of people as people, and that, in a sense, gives you a point of reference that kind of almost protects you from the influence of a lot of stereotypes that go around about different groups. You've used a couple of terms, and I'd like to explore them a little bit. Obviously, advocacy. I'm very interested to understand, what does that mean in terms of the work that you do? What is advocacy, especially as it relates to a Christian organization?
What is advocacy as it relates to a Christian organization? Well,
both. What is advocacy? What does that mean in terms of what you're doing, and then further in terms of a Christian context?
So what I do here, so I'll briefly start saying what I work. So I moved to Geneva because the human rights institutions of the United Nations, almost all of them are based here in Geneva. And these institutions like the Human Rights Council, the Human Rights Committee, the special rapporteurs on various issues, including country rapporteurs and thematic rapporteurs, such as a special rapporteur on a given country like Iran, or a special rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. They're all here. And there's a need to be here if you want to, as a body, which is the World Evangelical Alliance, if you want to advocate on behalf of the members, the National Evangelical Alliance, members in the World Evangelical Alliance, WEA. If you want to advocate on their behalf, namely for freedom of religion or belief, but not only, we would relay whatever they would want us to relay here. There's a need to be present, to have a presence in Geneva, to have connections and bridges to the human rights institutions, the Human Rights Council. In a week's time, the 39th session of the Human Rights Council will start. We just submitted 8 written statements, and we're planning several oral statements to this council. All the information is taken from the people on the ground, our national alliances and our partners, and mostly advocating for freedom of religion or belief and highlighting where things are going wrong and issuing recommendations. So this is my work, my current work. What does advocacy look like in general? Well, advocacy is, when I was in Lebanon, I also was involved in human rights advocacy. One of the campaigns I worked on is advocating for the right of Palestinian refugees to work in Lebanon because they were denied the right to work in Lebanon. You've been a refugee since 1948, but the legislation denies you the right to work. in Lebanon. So we've worked with the Palestinians on a campaign, and that meant putting pressure on the decision makers in Lebanon, the parliament and the council of ministers, but more broadly, the political parties and the positions of power, to basically advocate for a change in the legislation. And in a country like Lebanon, advocacy takes a very special meaning. You have to convince the Christians that you are not advocating for the permanent settlement of a Sunni majority population, and then you have to convince the Muslims that you are not advocating for these people to take jobs that would replace their own, the Lebanese, take the jobs of the Lebanese and the Sunni communities that the majority Palestinians live in. So you have a lot of dynamics, and then you have to prove that this is better for the economy and healthier for the economy. So it's quite challenging. It's quite challenging, and within the Christian community, it's also challenging in the sense where, Christian values don't inform the Christian politics in Lebanon. You have Christian political parties, but the issues of hospitality, caring for the poor, are not in the discourse. What's in the discourse is often, similarly to everywhere else in the world, is we need to protect ourselves from this evil from the other. And this is sad in the sense where it misses out on our mission of being salt and light in this world. So so this is a sample of advocacy in Lebanon. Whereas when we come here in Geneva, basically the dynamic is you'd want to put pressure on governments using the mechanisms and tools available in Geneva. You put pressure on governments so that they would respect the freedom of general belief or other human rights as related to us by our national alliances. This is briefly of advocacy done here in Geneva.
But it's interesting. So it sounds like developing a statement is just the start of a larger process. In some ways, it sounds like you do the work of a diplomat, where you're having to meet with different groups and helping them to understand some of these issues and try to gain their support.
Yes, absolutely. So when we got, a statement is first and foremost, you basically gather incredible specific information, factual and recent. And oftentimes this is not available. And this is a major problem. It's like, something is going wrong, but you don't have the credible information to act upon it. So this is an initial important thing we do with our alliances. And it's not always easy because sometimes the alliances are not able to, they would say we have a problem, but they're not able to have the sufficient resources to document these problems. So we would sometimes need to help them in that. So once you have the information, we insert it in the various places here in Geneva. So first, the Human Rights Council. Second, we would send it out to diplomatic missions, including those that have, where missions that would be ready to lobby and advocate for freedom of religion or belief. Third, I even sent them yesterday to the diplomatic missions of the countries concerned, meaning, we wrote something on Sudan, we sent it to the Sudanese mission, and we told them, I would love to meet with you and talk about this and hear your feedback. A few weeks ago, we sent the report to the Malaysian embassy, and then we went and met with the deputy head of mission, and we discussed all of this, and that was important also. So it's not, we're not in a place where we want to name and shame and attack. We want to be in a place where we want to say, look, this is the problem, and please let's discuss how we can move to a better place. So and this is how we view Christian advocacy as Christians, even as salt and light, is not by attacking and defaming and being aggressive, but being kind and gentle. And it's not always easy in such an environment, but we're praying to be able to do so.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear how this begins with having credible evidence. I'm guessing then that you need to, either yourself or you need to partner with people like respected journalists, or even perhaps scientists, social scientists, who might bring some rigor to developing that evidence so that when you go and meet with people, that you have some credibility. It can't just be your opinion that something is going on. There's got to be something that puts some weight behind that.
Yes. Yeah, not just journalists or scientists, but I mean, for us, it's important to partner with the National Alliance and in the WEA, other departments other than ours, like the Religious Liberty Commission at the WEA, they try to equip local alliances to have with lawyers, Christian lawyers, or with the ability to basically document and report on violations, and all this feeds into our work here in Geneva. So, for example, I was quite impressed to see in Sri Lanka or in India using crowd mapping, meaning putting the incidents with a good description on a map and tracking visually, recording these incidents, and then using them later for reporting purposes. And I would love to see more of such crowd mapping in areas where there's hostility towards the Christians and there are problems. Yeah.
And for those who may not know that term, can you say a little more about crowd mapping? What is that?
Yeah, it's when you use, let's say you have a Google map, and basically you put a layer of you put the incidents and the pins, and each pin has a description of what happened and the date. You know, a church was burned down, or a pastor was attacked, or something happened in this area, and then once you put them on a crowd, you can on a map, you can visualize. You know, maybe even over time, if you do it if you have the ability to do over time, you can visualize the incidence and the gravity of a given situation. And then you can have a record of what happened in this area and what's happening in this area, where are the hot spots, what's the trend over time. And this is done because of the access to software like Google Maps and other mapping software.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned working with the alliances, so it sounds like another part of what you do really depends upon having a good relationship with a national partner, like a National Evangelical Alliance in our case. And further, that partner then really needs to be able to develop the information around whatever are the violations that are occurring there.
Yes, absolutely. Our mission here is basically to serve our national alliances, and this is a privilege, this is humbling, and this is also empowering in the sense where it's not up to me sitting in an office to decide I want to work on this or this is how it goes. No, it's more of I want to listen to what the alliances want and where there are emergencies to be responsive, and then where there are opportunities here in Geneva to basically relay to the National Alliance, look, there's a review for your government happening on X date, and this is the deadline to submit a report. Like we have a deadline on 4 October to submit, we want to submit 3 reports for 3 countries. And one of them is the Democratic Republic of Congo, another one is Bhutan, another one is Albania. You know, 3 continents, 3 countries. We spoke with 3 national alliances, and I'm in touch with them now to basically help them in the report writing process. Mm-hmm. So yes, we represent our members here, and we're a voice for these members who are at the end of the day representing 600 million evangelicals, more or less.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a couple of examples. Can we look more closely at one of them to see what does this advocacy process actually look like as you're working with the national group?
Sure. I mean, would you like me to? So I can give briefly the example of Bhutan and then also maybe DRC. I mean, with Bhutan, and we contacted the head of the alliance and told them, look, would you like us to submit something? Would you have issues you would like to bring up? And the answer was yes. So we basically had an initial conversation. And this is where we see how well equipped usually and how prepared is a national alliance capable, how equipped they are to basically send us the information. And this is where I have to be very flexible. I have very flexible, meaning, should I have a phone call for a few hours and take all the notes and input and then type something? Or should they send me initial documents and then have an exchange and then do some research on the side and then go back to the National Alliance? So now I'm in that phase. The Bhutan Alliance were able to send me a document highlighting their priorities, highlighting a few issues, and then now I want to basically start preparing this report, but always in a dialogue with them. The Democratic Republic of Congo is another case, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, along with Central African Republic and a few other countries, is where the priority is not freedom of original belief, but where national evangelical alliances are locally involved in peace-building efforts, in humanitarian aid and relief, and where we would like to come alongside them and then relay, add a layer to their peace-building efforts, and then to their, aid and relief efforts, add this layer of advocacy to their efforts, and then bring their voice to Geneva on what they want. And that's how, in the process that we've been working on with the Democratic Republic of Congo, we have there's a national alliance that is not yet member in the World Evangelical Alliance, and we opened a conversation many months ago with them, trying to understand what they would like us to bring, what issues to bring up, knowing that it's a huge country and the challenges are quite significant. The least of which, is having democratic elections in December and having peaceful democratic elections free of violence. So, but with the alliance, and then with the coalition, actually, so there's a Christian coalition. One of it is with the Alliance. WA is a member in the Christian coalition. There's MICA. There's local NGOs. We had a conversation, and first, thematically, we chose, and they decided to work on internally displaced population and the rights of the internally displaced population. That's quite important when you think that it's the country with over 4 million displaced people, which is a huge number. By all criteria. And then that's when, so once they chose this, basically I sought to say, this is the legal framework for the protection of internally displaced. And then part of the research on humanitarian work would help feed into understanding the violations on human rights issues of the internally displaced, and what the government should do and what other actors should be doing. And then from that, so lay out the facts, come up with the recommendations, and then be able to use them here. In addition to the issue of internally displaced, I sent a list of questions. I did some research and then sent a list of questions to better understand how they would like to be a voice in terms of the democratic processes that are taking place, and the democratic elections that should be taking place in December, if all goes as planned. It's a very volatile area. I asked our members how would they like to articulate their input into this, knowing that we also have to be very careful for the security of our members. We have to be very careful. In many countries, the government would not be happy to see locals sending information to Geneva. We've seen in other countries where the alliance would like to keep a low profile. We can try to be vocal, but there's a limit also to how vocal we can be, and then how visible they would be. In other countries, the alliance doesn't mind being, co-signing the reports, and others, the alliance doesn't appear. So
just to clarify, but excuse me, Wissam, just to clarify that, you're saying in some context, if a local group is directly advocating with the UN, there could be consequences within the country that some governments would not look on that very favorably.
Yes, absolutely. in many countries, I would say that if you're advocating at the UN, governments would not look at that favorably. Some would, they would threaten the people. Some put them in jail. Or we've had one case of a lengthy interrogation upon return from Geneva. In one case, in another country, we submitted a report, and then we offered for the local alliance to come and visit to Geneva. They wisely preferred not to come, and later we found out that all the human rights advocates who wanted to come to Geneva on a specific date from that country were barred from coming by their government. So, I couldn't, yeah.
As you know, in DRC, we've had a couple of NGOs who are part of the coalition who specifically opted out of being part of the advocacy effort because of the possible consequences for them, for their work in the country, where they need to maintain a good relationship with the government. Which brings me to a question, and it sounds like another part of your work is to be very aware of these possible consequences and to work with the local groups so that they don't put themselves into some dangerous or at least difficult situation.
Absolutely. On DRC, I've been coordinating with the Anglicans here in Geneva, with the Catholics, and with other groups involved in DRC. And they're all, I would say, this is off the record, so no one's going to publish this, but I mean, they're all wary of, they're all trying to do the difficult task of balancing, advocacy and public advocacy versus private advocacy. It's not easy. They're trying to balance it. The stakes are high, and the church and across the denominations is well present in the DRC, and they all have opinions, and they all want to see the country stabilize and move democratically, but they need a lot of wisdom to know what to say, when, and how public or how private it can be.
Yeah, and just to clarify that term, so I assume public advocacy is what we're talking about when you present things openly to a country mission or to the Human Rights Council. What is private advocacy? What does that look like?
Private advocacy is when basically you communicate with the diplomatic missions in a private way. You go visit and you send them reports so that they would take action in a specific direction at the Human Rights Council and elsewhere, but without attribution, without the NGO behind the communication being publicly known, without your action being publicly known, you would influence the diplomatic missions to act in a way at the Human Rights Council. So this is private advocacy. And this, of course, it happens in Geneva, especially with many countries there's high risk, where human rights defenders are in jail. So if you're a church and you're saying that the secular human rights defenders are thrown to jail, but you need to speak up, you have to be very wise in knowing how to speak up.
So would you say that there's a balance in your own work between that more public advocacy and private advocacy? You find yourself doing both about the same?
I would say that in my work so far, we're blessed to be able to be quite public, because in a significant part, because we are trying to bridge to the concerned countries and seeking a dialogue. So I would say in most part, we've been able to remain public. Well, in a few cases, we would not highlight the sources of our information, but that does not mean that as WA we wouldn't be public. No, we do things quite publicly.
Yeah, interesting. I want to circle back to another point you made that I think is really important to clarify, and that is the connection to human rights. So you're not only gathering information about what has happened, but it sounds like in particular you're working with the national group to see where these constitute human rights violations. So it sounds like documents, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the rights of internally displaced people, or rights of women and girls. It sounds like you're being knowledgeable about these documents and human rights issues is also very important.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have at a personal level, I did a master's degree, and in the past 12 years, I've worked on a variety of issues, including human rights, humanitarian law, meaning the laws of armed conflict, refugee law. And once you come here, also, you need to be aware of the legal mechanisms that exist, that have been created by international treaties, like the Human Rights Committee, that was created to oversee the implementation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And then there is the Convention Against Torture that has its own committee and mechanisms, including individual complaint mechanisms. All of these also have individual complaint mechanisms. So you need to be aware of the law and of the human rights mechanisms, and so that to be able to make use of all of these tools. Now, my area of focus here most recently, and because of working with the World Evangelical Alliance, here the area of focus is freedom of original belief, and this is not an easy subject. Freedom of original belief includes everything ranging from conversion and the legality of conversion. We see a lot of Hindu countries denying the right to convert or putting hurdles for conversion, leading up to everything like in France, where the denial for women to wear a veil could be a violation of freedom of original belief. Denial to wear a veil in the workplace, denial to wear her veil, her hijab in school. So there's a huge spectrum, and it's a huge field by itself, the freedom of original belief that we are working on here.
Yeah, very good. So coming back to the example of DRC, you mentioned that you bring another layer to that effort. So what the local alliance is very concerned about displaced people, as you know. They're looking at assisting them in several ways, including, as you mentioned, peace and reconciliation, but also orchestrating relief. So as you bring in the layer of advocacy, what might the DRC Alliance expect or hope for out of the advocacy effort? In other words, how will advocacy hopefully help this initiative in DRC?
So, you would, if you view a spectrum, you would see the humanitarian efforts as on a spectrum where the humanitarian efforts stop because, there's something that you cannot do. So there's a problem you cannot solve via humanitarian efforts, is probably where the spectrum of advocacy starts, meaning you can provide food, but then there's this major problem where you cannot solve. The government should be addressing it, or the international community should be addressing it. And this is where advocacy begins. This is where you need to put pressure first and foremost in the DRC, first and foremost locally, not in Geneva. First and foremost, you need to be working in the DRC and saying, okay, what should the government be doing? What should the United Nations peacekeeping force be doing? What should the United Nations humanitarian agencies be doing better or more or differently? And this is where advocacy starts, is basically communicating with these actors and then maybe at some point putting pressure. Now, things reach in Geneva because in Geneva, locally, if you're not able to put pressure, which is the case in DRC or elsewhere, things would reach Geneva and you would need to basically submit your case to the various bodies. Now in Geneva, there are at the Human Rights Council sessions, there are dialogue and panel discussions on the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this is where we can have an oral statement, a written statement. We can have a discussion with experts and special rapporteurs and all this community here to try to, get them to adopt our recommendations, or to see how we can together work to get the government to do something in one direction. So this is briefly, I mean, how, so on IDPs, on the internally displaced, you know, again, there's a, if once the government, let's say you're working on relief and aid, but you reach a certain, okay, you're giving food to people, shelter, but then there's a structural problem. Say, for example, that security is in the areas of where the displaced are in is not sufficient. And that's one. And then security to lead back to return is insufficient. So who's in charge of this? Primarily the government, and second, maybe it could be the United Nations peacekeeping forces, and then the government, you know, and then giving the example of Lebanon, after the civil war, we had a ministry for the internally displaced to help the internally displaced return. And I was suggesting as a long-term solution, what are the mechanisms, governmental mechanisms in the DRC to help these millions of internally displaced return, you know, to decent housing, gain back decent livelihood. So these are issues that first, you know, local alliance should be advocating for with the government, but then also relate to Geneva.
We use the example of DRC, and as you know, we're relatively early in the process with them. Perhaps is there another example where your advocacy work is further along that might illustrate some of what you're talking about in terms of bringing that other layer to the national work?
Well, I would give the example, if I give the example of Algeria. In Algeria, in 2017, our office here submitted a report because that year the Algerian government's human rights record was being reviewed in a process we call the Universal Periodic Review. The Universal Periodic Review here in Geneva is where every country's human rights record, on universal because it's all the human rights charter, all the human rights mechanisms, nothing is excluded. Periodic because it's every 4 to 5 years. So every country, every 4 to 5 years, their complete human rights record will be reviewed here. And this is a huge instrument that was created with the Human Rights Council. So it was a time for Algeria's review. We spoke with our National Alliance, and we decided to submit here a request to amend the legislation and allow the local alliance to register and be legally recognized. This was in 2017. Then we invited the head of the National Alliance to come here and to visit, and including to visit his own country's diplomatic mission. After that, once he was back in Algeria, he was able to get a meeting with the Ministry of Interior that was consequent to his visit to Geneva. We view that as a positive thing that helped him. However, in November 2017, the government committee started visiting churches and closing them with the excuse of the building is building safety regulations. And we started seeing churches being closed, and that's when we needed to shift into a more emergency mode. So we basically had submissions during the Human Rights Council's regular sessions. We had reports submitted there and oral declarations. The Human Rights Committee of Algeria was meeting in June, July, reviewing the Algeria's record. We also made a submission there and got the government to discuss with the committee what's happening, and the committee issued recommendations that were basically aligned with what we wanted them to say, which was very positive. And then we also spoke with the special rapporteur on freedom of original belief. So this is a third mechanism. So you see the Human Rights Council, Human Rights Committee, special rapporteur, and we also got Swiss media in French to interview pastors and interview me and bring this up in the media. And so we we've utilized these various mechanisms leading up to, in June, to the opening of 3 out of the 7 or 8 closed churches. But then in July, they closed down 1 more church. So I would say that I wouldn't say we've been really fruitful. The pressure is, we must put pressure here. We must bring these up here, these various issues. It will not, Geneva and the human rights mechanisms will not solve the world's problem, especially currently when a lot of everybody's saying that the human rights situation globally is retreating, that nationalism and discrimination are rising, that the civic space for civil society is shrinking, that human rights defenders are being attacked. So in this global context, this is making things harder for advocating freedom of original belief. However, we strongly believe that we need to basically be present and be doing this advocacy. And I reconnect this with the case of Algeria, is that maybe we're not seeing necessarily the full fruit of our efforts, maybe partial fruit. Maybe the fruit is that the government stopped and did not continue shutting down the churches that they had visited, let's say around 2025, but they shut down 8, then opened 3, and then shut down 1. But maybe our efforts bear fruit in the sense where the government stopped. We don't really know fully, but we're continuing our efforts here, and we're doing our best, listening to and it's very important for us to be listening very closely to what the Alliance wants and keeping in touch with them, and not just shouting here without what the Alliance, the tone and the content that the Alliance provide us. So this was an example of one country where we've worked on a lot of mechanisms to basically get them to stop the closure of churches.
Yeah. You mentioned a number of challenges. For example, the rise of nationalism. It sounds like that global trend is really making your work more difficult.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in India and other Hindu countries, Hindu nationalism is translating into attacks and lynching of non-Hindus, Muslims and Christians. So, and we submitted a statement to that effect. So this is just one example. And this is I mean, and this the outgoing High Commissioner for Human Rights, al-Hussein, whose term finishes today, he wrote in The Economist yesterday an op-ed, and he said that in India there is high risk of clashes and internal violence between Hindu and Muslims, Muslim radicals and Hindu, because of the Hindu nationalism and radical Islam. And I mean, the world is moving in a scary direction. I'm not even talking about the role of President Trump and the current administration. I'm still, but the disengagement of the U.S. from the Human Rights Council and other human rights organizations and unilateralism is unfortunately contributing to these problems. It's weakening these global institutions that exist that help us deal with these various problems. So in this climate, we must work for freedom of original belief. We must channel the voices of our national alliances. We must be present here, but we also need to be aware that some of the dynamics are going in the wrong direction. Some of those who are our allies on these issues, including the United States administration, who want to defend freedom of original belief, are basically undermining some of the institutions where we could defend freedom of original belief.
Yeah, I think that's something that's perhaps not well understood here in the U.S., that when the U.S. pulls out of the Human Rights Council, it's not only something that has consequences in terms of the U.S. reacting to things that they dislike, but it has global consequences where, as you say, the presence of the U.S. lends support to the defenders of human rights around the world, and that support then is pulled away and has some real consequences for them.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And there's not just pulling out, but also reducing the funding or defunding some institutions. It's all how do I say it? I mean, dictators and those in power look at this as an opportunity, saying, "Okay, I'm so happy that the U.S. withdrew. Now we I think this is a signal for us to be, the criticism will be less effective now if the major power player left and then left the council, and those who stay are the quote unquote bad guys." This is not true, but I'm just saying that this is a caricature perception, a perception by countries who would be violating human rights, who would be violating freedom of belief, and they before the US withdrew, there was talk that China and Russia were trying to reduce the funding for the Human Rights Council and other bodies, and then comes the US withdrawing, and then also talking about reducing funding. What happened? What happened that these three major powers suddenly, their actions were aligned on something that fundamentally they disagree with, which is, or disagree on, or they're critical of one another on these issues, but then they aligned on defunding or reducing funding for the human rights mechanisms. And maybe there's one more issue in all of this. These institutions and the United Nations came after the horrors of the Second World War. Now that we have forgotten the horrors of the Second World War, we're doing away with the institutions that were meant to prevent such horrors, the Holocaust and other other horrors. When the UN was created, it was to prevent the repeat of the mass atrocities that took place. And now we seem to have forgotten these horrors. The generation that lived through it is gone. And what are we doing? We're dismantling the institutions, or we are opposing the multilateral institutions that help us prevent future wars. So that was as brief as I can get.
Yeah. Well, certainly that's a very big topic. We could almost do another interview just around the challenges that you face in terms of doing advocacy. Let's shift to one more topic with the time we have left. And how does this relate to the local church? If there's a local church that's saying, okay, is there a place for us in advocacy? Is there something that we might be doing if we're concerned about oppressed groups? We talked about working at the National Alliance level, but how about more at the local level? Is there anything here for the local church?
When we read the Bible, and especially the Old Testament, it's surprising the amount of passages that talk about justice, that talk about human dignity, that talk about caring for the poor, the needy, the widow, the orphan, talking about justice, talking about speaking on behalf of the poor. The Bible never puts a responsibility on the poor. It puts a responsibility on us as members of the body of Christ to care for the poor, to care for the other, to seek justice. God does not like injustice. To be righteously angry at the face of injustice. If this is a foundation for our faith, together with our, sharing the gospel and witnessing, but if justice is a character of God, then this is something that we must be seeking because the Bible says so. Then advocacy is also essential. It's also important to advocate for justice, to be vocal, to speak out on behalf of those who cannot speak. to be a voice for the voiceless. And Job, when he wanted to talk about a lot of the good things he did, he spoke about how people respected him. In chapter 29 of Job, he would be talking about how he snatched the praise from the mouths of the people who were trying to, take their praise. He spoke about how he cared and he did justice as a judge. So there's just one example out of hundreds in the Bible that informs our action today.
Mm-hmm. So the work that you do is at the global and national level, but the same type of work can go on very much at the local level. I mean, just briefly, I'm reminded of a church that I belong to that was concerned when a low-income housing unit was going to be torn down, replaced with more profitable condominiums, but with no thought about the poor people who would be displaced or any way to give them an alternative for their own housing. And several churches came together to speak for those poor people and to go to the local government. And they succeeded in stopping that until there was some arrangement made, for the poor individuals there. So that it sounds like that's a similar process, just at a more local or a smaller scale.
Yeah, absolutely. Work in Geneva, advocacy for the church does not start in Geneva. It usually starts at the very local level. And our role here is to support the churches, to support the local church's vision by relaying here to Geneva, just like in DRC and elsewhere. Mm-hmm. In the States, I'm very much aware of how much, a lot of churches are active on issues of justice. And how some ministries try to address some ministries. I mean, I know there's a lot of tension politically in the States, but I've heard a lot of amazing stories of how the churches intervene in support of the poor and the needy in the United States and also with elsewhere, namely with the issues of refugees. Here in Geneva, in Switzerland, currently the former head of the Swiss Evangelical Alliance is facing a jail sentence because he housed a migrant who was illegally present, an asylum seeker whose request was rejected. So he helped him and gave him some food to buy some money to buy food, and then he was sentenced in the courts. And now there's a campaign and there's an appeal for this decision, but there's also a campaign saying that solidarity should not be a crime. And the amazing thing in all of this is it's a pastor, and he's doing this out of caring for the poor and needy. So we have to advocate. There's advocacy efforts now happening for him.
Yeah. So the message would be for those people who might be interested in becoming involved in this kind of work, they can begin just by looking around at their local community. There's probably a lot of advocacy work to be done in most communities around the world.
Yeah, it's mostly at the doorsteps. It's mostly those who need us are very close to us.
Yeah.
Those who need to advocate before getting to Geneva. It's kind of like the rich man and Lazarus. Lazarus was at the doorsteps of the rich man.
Mm-hmm. So if I'm a student preparing for a profession and I want to learn more about advocacy, what might you suggest to students on how they could learn more and find ways to incorporate this into their future work?
Well, I would say that they need to basically first start with an issue, a cause, an injustice that they would like to address. I mean, you can read a lot of resources. You can read a lot of resources on advocacy, but it will not make sense unless there's something that's close to your heart and you would like to advocate for and defend. And then you can start learning on how things work on a specific case. Or some issues would require community building and organizing. Other issues would require legal intervention in courts. But I would advise that if the students want to learn, they would need to basically take on a cause and see how to address. This is how we can learn. See how the church can respond to the needs of the community and be a good advocate.
Great advice. So in closing, is there anything else that you would like to say to people listening to this interview, or anything that we have failed to touch on that you think important?
At the United Nations, and other fora, like at the European Parliament, there's a lot of talk of the shrinking civil space globally. Shrinking civil space meaning there is less and less space for civil society to be vocal. And this means this puts a responsibility on us to be more vocal, to seek to be more vocal. And it's also that puts a responsibility on the church which is a natural civic space area, to be more vocal on issues of justice and caring for the poor and needy. Also the church in the West, being vocal on what's happening in the rest of the world. This is very important. A lot of the policies and decisions that happen UK, United States, Canada, France, and elsewhere impact the lives of people everywhere else in the world. And I would strongly recommend that the churches, try to intervene and fill this civic space, or contribute to this shrinking civic space.
Great advice. Wissam, thank you so much. This was really interesting. I really enjoyed talking with you about this, and very much appreciate you taking out the time to do it, especially, as you say, the Human Rights Council meeting starts in just a week. I know this is a very busy time for you.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure. Thank you for challenging me with your questions.
All right. Thanks very much.